You mentioned the Manhattan Project, and it reminded me that the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, he was being interviewed by Barry Weiss earlier this year, I think. And he said that he was really upset with what Silicon Valley was doing and all these stupid scientists trying to uh, satiate the demands of these idiot masses. You know, who cares about getting a sandwich to a guy in the fastest possible way with an app and a quadcopter? What science really needs to do is be put entirely under the government's thumb, much like the Manhattan Project. And that's how we'll really be engaged in a purposeful, human, nationalistic. It was horrifying.
So when was the most productive age of science? It's very interesting. It was not in democracy, but it was during the feudal age and absolutism. And it happened, the peak was the 19th century and early 20th century, when in Germany and also in England, but mostly in Germany, the princes, the federal princes, Germany was totally federal until 1919, very until 1871 totally, and then it was still quite federal until 1919, when the princes were competing for the best physicists and just financing them. Like people, they were financing people like Gauss or later other mathematicians and physicists. And then the small city of Göttingen obtained in just 10 or 15 years a number of Nobel Prizes like never before any other city. And that was because of subsidiarity, because the scientists, they could just work on the problems they thought were the problems where they have the highest likelihood to achieve something in their scientific lives. And they had the funding, they had excellent students with a great education to their disposition, and they just churned out great results. The age of Einstein, Max Planck, and so on, right? Where all the great discoveries in physics were made, most in Germany, and some also in other countries, but it has to do with giving scientists the freedom in the right cultural environment to do what they think is the best to bring science forward. So it's the exact opposite of what Karp is claiming it should be done. What Karp is claiming should be done is technocracy.
Yep.
So it's the idea to rule via science and technology, which will never work, because human beings will rebel. They will not accept being ruled in such a mechanistic and superficial way.
Hello, and welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and I am very happy to be joined by Jobst Landgrebe, author of a book that I'm very excited to talk to him about called The Hype Cycle, Uppers and Downers in Our Bipolar Culture. That's a fun little title. And sharp-eyed viewers will notice that the author listed is not the name I just tried hard to pronounce. Do you have anything you'd like to say about the pseudonym you used here?
Yeah, I used it because the repression of alternative views is now quite strong in Germany. At least you get professional disadvantages if you voice your thoughts against certain huge narratives, like the COVID narrative, the climate narrative, transgender narrative, racism narrative, and so on. And this book basically attacks all these modern myths and systematically shows why they are wrong. And when I wrote the book, I was afraid of the consequences for my professional life, because I was at that time for a short period working as an employee. Now I'm working on my own again as an independent non-employed entrepreneur, and now I'm less afraid, and so I've now disclosed the pseudonym, and I'm talking about the book freely. But chapter 5, the medical hype chapter, and a chapter later, chapter about racism, are very controversial, I think. So we can discuss this.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But before we do, let me tell the good folks a little bit about you. Why in the world are we listening to this man? So your bio is you were a married father of 5, nice, and a scientist who studies, among other things, medicine, biochemistry, and perhaps most importantly, philosophy. You have worked as a neurogeneticist, a university professor, a business strategy consultant, and entrepreneur, nice again, and currently an independent consultant, a visiting professor of the theory of science and AI at the University of Lugano. I think that's Switzerland, right?
Yes.
And senior research associate at the philosophy department of the University of Buffalo, New York. You are the author of the new book, come out April 2025, I believe, that we just showed, called The Hype Cycle, and many other works, including Why Machines Will Never Rule the World, with the co-author Barry Smith. I hope very much to talk to you both about that later. So, Jobst, you're my favorite kind of scientist. That is one that also studies philosophy. I am concerned. Scientists concern me. Um, I worry about smart people who delve deeply into one area of science or maybe one sub niche without having a broader context in their thinking. So I'm just curious before we get started on the book, can you tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey and how you ended up being the thinker that you are today?
My grandfather, Ludwig Landgrebe, was quite a well-known philosopher. He was the last PhD student of Edmund Husserl and also published several of his works posthumously. He also, with the help of another philosopher, saved a lot of his works from the Nazis who wanted to destroy his manuscripts. And but as a young boy, I already got interested in philosophy. And so basically, I started studying philosophy and classical philology, but then switched to medicine, biochemistry, and later mathematics. I finished medicine and biochemistry with degrees and PhD. Mathematics I didn't finish, but I published a lot in a lot of mathematical papers. And then when I was in my late 30s, I went back to philosophy and started scientifically working as a philosopher as well. Why did I do this? Because the mathematics and the sciences are very attractive, but they're insufficient to explain the world because they can only shed light on a certain subset of our world, namely the positive, which is physics and chemistry and the other sciences, and the purely theoretical mathematical entities which are interesting but also of very limited value to explain a lot of phenomena in our world. And so I wanted to get answers to other questions as well. That's why I went back to philosophy, and that's why I also published so much then in philosophy that I got these academic positions that I now have, which are not full-time positions but basically guest professor positions.
Very, very nice. I like your book very much. It seems like a great explanation for why our political situation seems so chaotic and oppressive. So, what caused you to write the book? Why did you title it that in a provocative way? What are you trying to say to the good people?
I think that we live in a dangerous period in the Western culture. So I think the Western culture is now in a very big decline, which started a long time ago in the middle of the 18th century with atheism becoming a philosophical mainstream. And then there are many steps that led ultimately to postmodern anti-rationalism, which is, I think, which was established by Martin Heidegger and other philosophers, then was popularized by French philosophers in the 50s and 60s, like Derrida and Foucault, and then became mainstream in the 90s and 2000s, and which is now dominating the humanities and politics and so on. And so this means that we have an anti-rational discourse now that is detached from facts and the classical way in which we have always seen the truth in the West since Aristotle, and which has replaced, so it's a type of nihilism, but it's also hedonistic, very materialistic, and also, which is even worse, has become collectivist as well. So I call this postmodern collectivism, and collectivism is a trend that evolved independently of what I just described since the early 19th century or late 18th century. Babeuf was the first collectivist, and it has now become, or one of the first, there were others, and it has now, these two movements have now merged into what I call postmodern collectivism, which some people call wokeness, but it's a very dangerous movement that has weakened the West and leads to a certain type of self-destruction. And the title of the book, to answer your question, was chosen as an anchor into this problem set. The phenomena I describe are not only hype phenomena, but hype is a nice etiquette to put onto this trouble. And this is basically how I came to the book. I wrote it because I gave I think early 2024, I gave a lecture at a conference. In the evening, we were having dinner, the faculty of this conference. And when I was talking, and the owner of the restaurant was standing behind my chair, and suddenly he said, it was all in French, because it was Neuchâtel, which is French speaking. He asked me, so I'm half Swiss, French Swiss, and he asked me whether I had never heard this and whether I could write a book about it. So I said, oh yeah, could I? Well, I said, I don't know. And all the others at the table said, yes, do it, Jobst. And so then I wrote the book.
Very, very nice. It's tempting to start at the end,
Yes.
what this means in our politics, but I'm going to resist that temptation and have you describe the various types of hype. You've separated them into two broad categories: fear hype and hope hype. Say a little something about the categories and then maybe dive into various examples.
Yes. So the whole basic framework of the book states that we live in an age of hype, and that for certain reasons that are political, that you want me to explain at the end, we are driven through hype cycles. Some of them arise spontaneously, but a lot of them are also financed actively and pushed actively through Western populations. And there are two big categories. There are science hypes, which are around topics which are scientific, but the hypes are unscientific. An old unscientific hype I'm not covering in the book was the acid rain, which was a hype of the 80s, where they said now with the sulfur dioxide that comes out of our cars, it would destroy our forests, and nothing of this was true. They said there would be acidic rain, and this acidic rain was destroying the forest, but it wasn't true. It was completely unreal, and there have been many. These are the science hypes, and I can list some of them a bit later. And then there are cultural hypes, which have to do with narratives emanating from the humanities, and they are basically around topics like social justice and injustice, transgenderism, and other cultural topics that have nothing to do with natural sciences. And both groups of hypes are very dangerous and are not true, but they are widely believed and they are used to drive political agendas.
Yes, they are. And what's the danger of the hope style hype? Does it mollify us? Does it keep us? Does it distract us? Does it bewilder us?
So there's fear and hope hype. That's true, that I described in the book. And fear hype is very often the first type of hype. Let's look at COVID. So in COVID, we have fear hype. We had fear hype that this is a very dangerous pathogen that is going to kill at least 10% of the population, and that's so dangerous that we need to perform measures that we haven't seen in Europe since we had the plague. Right? We have really, and actually, even in the 19th century, there were plague epidemics, but none of them led to measures comparable to COVID. So we haven't had measures that we had in the COVID area since the 17th century. So last time we had this 1620s, 1630s, measures of this radical nature. We haven't had for hundreds of years, 500, 400 years. And they were justified with fear. And then the hope was the vaccination. And the vaccination was, and I can go into details, and is ineffective and also toxic. But so it's a dangerous hope because it's a false hope. And many of these hypes have this paired structure of fear and hope. Another one is war mongering, where you have fear of an enemy and hope from wonder weapons. Like now we have the Tomahawk hype, that the Tomahawk missiles will finally lead to a victory against the dangerous Russians who are threatening Europe and so on. So this is the kind of dangerous hope that you see in these cycles.
Yeah, it's pernicious because, as you say in the book, there are at least conceivable justifications for emergency powers of government to handle some truly threatening situation. But obviously, people who are in charge can quickly come to the realization, hey, what if we invent our own calamity to which it's justifiable to gain more, grab more power and exert more authority? So what are the differences between the types of manufactured hypes you're talking about and something that is more natural and organic and perhaps a justifiable reason for relinquishing liberty a little bit?
I mean, first of all, if you have a real military invasion by an enemy, then you have a real emergency. So of course, in Eastern Ukraine, there is a real emergency from the perspective of the Ukrainians because their country was invaded. Now they tried the right reaction in April when they tried to do peace negotiations, but the West disrupted them. But so if you are invaded by an enemy, that's a real emergency. If you have a real natural catastrophe, it's an emergency. Chernobyl was a real emergency where you need a real state of emergency. So the state of emergency is basically justified if there's a real threat that is so overwhelming that you cannot wait for democratic procedures or normal will formation to fend off the threat. And then you need emergency measures, but you need to return to the normal state of affairs once the emergency is over. You shouldn't stay in the emergency mode. And what we see now in the West is that we stay in the emergency mode. Now, you said something very important. You said that you talked about manufactured hypes. So I think that most of the hypes have actually a real portion or part from which they are then exaggerated. So there was, of course, a real COVID virus. Russia is indeed aggressive against Ukraine, but very often the manufactured part is an exaggeration of the real part of the hype that is also involving a dominance over media. So this podcast is part of a movement that is new, that tries to create an independent sphere of reporting and opinion exchange again. But we now have our big media are totally dominated, and they are owned by the same people who own the pharma industry, who own the military industrial complex, who own food industry, agriculture. So these are the same owners, and that's very problematic because they can now, the same people who make certain economic decisions also can influence the political decision making. And this is the manufactured part. But usually all these hypes also have a real portion to them, but it can be very small.
Yeah, well said. I want to underscore that point or hit it from a different angle. You say in the book, why do democracies fall into an illegitimate state of government so regularly? And I think it's involving these hypes you're talking about. So, I mean, on the one hand, we could just dive into a handful of hypes specifically, but I'd rather get a little bit broader overview. What do you think is going on in our culture or our politics that causes these hypes to be generated? Why do we fall for them? I mean, part of it, it's a little black-pilled, but I wonder if our species is just not evolved to correctly understand the complexity of our world, such that we just believe the talking head or the politician when they scream COVID danger or climate, global warming hysteria, or we need to invade the Middle East, otherwise you won't be safe in Topeka, Kansas, or whatever. So how did we get here? Was there a pivot point that we can point to? Or how do you think it happened? How do we find our way back?
So first of all, if you look at the history of urbanized societies, which is now 5,000 years, you have always that the masses, that there is a tendency that you can tell the masses a lot of lies and they will believe it for quite a while. And that has to do with the necessity to accept the monopoly of power of the state and the role of the state in our lives. Because of course the state is a necessity. It's not a nice one, but we need the state. And to cope with this necessity, most people have a positive view of the state or the authorities. And actually to give this up and to see them as pernicious and as your enemy, which I think there are now in the West, is a big step and removes a lot of comfort from your life and changes your life, because suddenly the authorities that rule over you are your enemies, and it's very hard to accept. So therefore, populations usually for long periods tend to prefer to accept falsehoods and lies, and only when they're really desperate, they come to realize that they should stop trusting the state. And so this is, first of all, historical truth. Second of all, and this is more important for our situation, against this background, we have now, since 50 years, a slow delegitimation of rule in the West. So I think we live in a post-democratic state. So that means that what is important for democracy is rule of law, natural law, and socioeconomic participation. And I think socioeconomic participation has dropped tremendously since the 1970s. And this drop in socioeconomic participation creates a lot of frustration and reduces the trust in the state and the legitimacy of the state. And the hype narratives try to make up for this lack of natural legitimacy by creating legitimacy via fear or false hopes. And I think this is the cultural main reason is just in post-democratic societies, to rule, you need to drive the people into fear because otherwise they will not accept the rule. So now in Germany, we have a huge war hype. Conscription is again on the agenda and a lot of spending for weapons. And this is legitimized by fear because they tell us the Russians will attack us. This is, of course, utter nonsense. It's out of question the Russians will not invade us, but it's used to legitimize the spending and the behavior of the politicians, which serve certain interests. And in the end, it's about monopolizing the political will formation. And to do that, the hypes are basically created and brought about. And people want to believe in them because they prefer to have a positive picture of the state.
It is more comforting.
Yeah.
You make a distinction in the book between foolishness and stupidity. I mean, why the powerful people want to do these sorts of things makes perfect sense, but why on earth do we believe them? You mentioned the one aspect. It's more comforting to believe that mommy and daddy are not only in charge, but have our best interests at heart. But I do think that the foolishness-stupidity dichotomy is also important. Can you break that down?
Yes, it also applies to the rulers, actually. So stupidity means that you cannot understand structures and patterns. That the lower your IQ is, the harder you find it to understand certain patterns and structures. And the higher your IQ is, the better you are at understanding patterns, structures, relationships. And therefore, to do mathematics at today's level, at the frontier of mathematical research, you need to have a very high IQ because the relationships between the entities have become very complicated. For example, right? And if you have a routine job at an assembly line, the pattern is always the same, so you can cope if you have a low IQ. That's stupidity. Stupidity is, of course, a reason to swallow under complex explanations, because if you're stupid, you are not disturbed by a simplifying explanation, because that's the only one you can understand. This is where stupidity helps in powerful people who are able to design messages based on a complex understanding. They can simplify the complexity to a simple message, and then stupid people will believe it. Now, foolishness is more interesting, because foolishness is something that is also applicable to highly intelligent people, and it means that your intellect and your ability to understand structures is overwhelmed by emotions. And Erasmus of Rotterdam, who wrote the classical book about foolishness, he says that the two emotions that have the strongest power to overwhelm our intellect is sexuality and aggression. And that's true. And they come in many flavors, but essentially, this is why they are also used very often to overwhelm people and to drive them into foolish behavior. And foolishness on the side of the politicians means that they act against their own interest. A phenomenon that the great historian Barbara Tuchman, an American historian, she was really great, described in the 1980s in her book The Distant Mirror, and also her book about political foolishness. And she basically says that foolish politicians, like the Renaissance popes, for example, they take political measures that harm themselves without noticing it, although there were at the time publicly discernible voices that warned of these foolish decisions. But they did it for lust of power, and because they were overwhelmed by their will to accumulate more power, to have more money, to have more influence, and they start acting against their own interests. And I think that is what's happening in the West right now. So we have a very foolish governments in the West who try to overextend their power, who are overextending their power. And then the foolishness on the part of the population can be seen very well in COVID, where a lot of people in the population, many groups, were so afraid of this contagious disease that they stopped thinking, stopped actually. You didn't need to read any papers or mathematical studies to understand that people were not falling dead on the street like when the plague is happening, right? Nobody was dying. I mean, a few elderly, but actually, you could, if you were looking around among the people you knew, at least before the vaccination campaign happened, there was no elevation in death rates or anything that was visible in your neighborhood, in what you could overlook, right? And so this basic ability to observe what was going on was overwhelmed by fear, and people believed the television and the radio more than their own ability to observe the world. That's the same with the climate hype, by the way. And this is foolishness as well, because your natural intellect and you don't need a high IQ to achieve this, right? And this was overwhelmed by fear. So this is the mass foolishness that we saw in COVID, for example.
Yes, very well said. As I was reading your book, or at least selected parts of it, it crossed my mind that fear hype, as you said, justifies a permanent state of emergency, which is what the powerful people want. But it also shatters rules and norms that we need for society to function. It specifically raises time preference. A panicked people don't plan for the future, shattering the structures and institutions that enable us to be as productive and as wealthy as we can. That all disappears, or at least is greatly diminished, when we get terrified like a stampeding cattle. And so this thing that just keeps, I mean, there's several chapters in your book, and they're all a different hype, and each and every one of them is literally anti-civilizational. So I'm wondering, I don't know, it's probably a question you can't answer, but is there a remedy?
Yes.
And should we be just as disturbed by these, the hope hypes? A lot of people think, I don't need to prepare for the future. AI and robots are going to be running everything in 5 months anyway. So I think the hope hypes are just as infantilizing, because they make humans not try to push their civilization into the future themselves. Rather, we'll wait for the experts to figure it out. It all seems very depressing.
So let's start with the time preference. So the big difference between humans and animals is, one big difference is that humans can postpone their needs, right? And actually, and it's very nicely explained in Robinson Crusoe, where Robinson Crusoe is making savings and keeping provisions and investing into his future, and basically performing as a one person image or symbol everything that the Western society does. In a very short time, in 2 or 3 years, he's building up manufacturing and everything. And it's a very nice book, because it basically shows this ability of human beings to keep at bay their immediate needs and to invest into the future. And I think it's a very good point you make, which I don't make so much in the book, that this is impeded by the hype cycles. One very good example is that the city of Hamburg has now destroyed Europe's or the world's most advanced coal plant. They have it was built for 3.5 billion. Then the city of Hamburg bought it from the energy firm and spent 500 million to destroy it, but completely destroy it. So there's nothing left of it. And it was never actually in production, because they were so afraid of the carbon dioxide emitting from it that they destroyed it. So this is very good example of this behavior. Now it shows to what extent they have become crazy and irrational. Now I believe that there's a proportion of society that is like this. It's around 20% of the population, mostly high educated. And they have become crazy, really, and detached from reality and fanaticized. Now, we have had such periods before. And what is interesting is that powerful people, like let's say Getty Foundation, Ford Foundation, Soros Foundation, they have actually recognized these people as excellent transporters of narratives of power. So they have basically teamed up with them, but also influenced them. It's a dialectical relationship, which has now, at the moment, a huge share of voice in the West, also in America, despite Trump. In America, it's now a bit different culturally, a bit different situation. But Trump operates, and his government, they operate with hype narratives like the others did, but slightly different hype narratives. But it's the same irrationality and self-harming behavior. And the hope now that I have, the real hope, not a false hope, is that once things really start to crumble, and there's mass poverty, or the credit system falls apart, or we lose a big war against Russia or Iran, that will basically lead to a change of mood, so that the silent majority of 80% will basically stand up, and then the 20% who have lost their mind will basically go back into silence. So I think that is going to happen, because the only alternative that we have in history is the Easter Island, where a population completely destroyed itself so that nobody survived. The Easter Island was the big heads made of stone.
Yeah.
They really eradicated themselves, but I don't think that's going to happen in the West, because the West has, it depends how you count, 1 billion or 1.5 billion or 2 billion inhabitants. So I think that not all countries will succumb to this, and that there will be a kind of healing, but I think it has to get worse before this is really stopped. But I don't think that we are about at a point of decivilization like at the fall of the Roman Empire. I rather think that it will be a big shock, and then there will be a recovery. So I don't think that, and that has to do with a very fundamental point, and that is that before the agricultural revolution, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. Once the agricultural revolution set in, those who participated in it never became hunter-gatherers again. The same is with the Industrial Revolution. Once you have lived through the Industrial Revolution, you don't go back into a purely agricultural society. But to maintain an industrial society, you need science. And so I believe that when things will be so bad that we will be on the verge of eclipsing the industrial society or civilization, there will be a renaissance, because the population, no matter how it's composed, will not tolerate this. Even the migrants who come to America and Europe, they come because they want to live in an industrialized society. They don't come because they want to live in a primitive society. And so there will be a very strong trend to restore the industrial civilization. But at the moment, we are at a point where we are really actively destroying the industrial civilization, which is very impressive and historically unprecedented, I think.
Yeah, we are in strange times. I say all the time, everything is in such massive flux. We could go in a lot of different directions, many of them awful, some of them wonderful. It would be nice if, as you say, our institutions revitalized and became healthy again. I have a sneaking suspicion that it's going to take radical political decentralization for that to occur. And my opinion on that is formed partially by the fact that the people who want to rule over us are pushing us in directions more like a one world government. And part of the reason they manufacture the types of hypes they manufacture is so that they can say, look, nationalism is an impediment to solving these problems. We need one world government to fix it. The climate hysteria is the perfect example of that. But of course, you could put war, epidemiology, various nonsensical theories about trade. So yeah, why are these globalists wrong? Why is one world government not as sweet as they make it look like in Star Trek?
So the reason that is the old debate between centralization of power and particularism.
Yeah.
And we have since 5,000 years a trend towards centralization, because 5,000 years ago there were only city-states which had a very small domain of a few thousand people, and now we have nations with 250, 300 million like the US. So we have already behind us a very long way to centralizing power. Now, when you centralize power, you and the US was so successful because though it centralized power, it left a lot of power at the local and at the federal state level. And why is this important? Because it allows people to live through their differences and to create laws that are culturally mirroring, that are legally mirroring the social differences. Like Texas has, of course, traditionally very different view of the world than Massachusetts, and the federal system of the United States has allowed these differences to manifest in lawmaking and many other culture, education system, and so on, which is great, which was one of the big factors that made America great. And but if you over centralize, you are not doing justice anymore to the cultural differences. Cultural differences are ineradicable because cultural identification happens at very many levels. Of course, each American to some extent identifies with the United States, but you also identify with your federal state, with your church denomination, with your group of friends, with your village or town or city. And all these levels of identification matter to an individual. Now, if only all the political decision making is now centralized, you cannot recognize your points of identification anymore. And you only should then identify with the central state, but that's only possible if you're a total creature of that central. And that's when you live in Washington, D.C. and are part of Capitol Hill, right? Then you are maybe, so to speak, you have all your identities and overwhelmed with being a part of Capitol Hill. But if you are not there, then you have other layers of identification that don't get satisfied. And that is the deepest meaning of political participation, is also cultural participation, which means that you need decentralization, so that you and political decision making at the bottom layers of society, so that people can identify with the political decision making. And therefore, centralization is always doomed to fail, and over centralization always leads to a self-destruction of over centralized societies like the USSR. But even Alexander's Macedonia or the Roman Empire, they were just overextended and too centralized, and then they fell apart. So over centralization doesn't work. Another reason why it doesn't work is that among powerful people, there's always a competition for more power.
Right.
And so therefore, the one world government is actually, the West wants to, maybe some oligarchs in the West want a one world government, but in the East, they want to basically have a hegemonial sphere. But I don't think that China wants to rule the world or Russia wants to rule the world. They just want to have their hegemonial spheres. And so the idea of a world government is a very Western idea. I could go into this, has very deep historical reasons, starting with the early Crusades. But it is rooted in Christianity, an aggressive version of Christianity. But it's actually impossible and will always fail.
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's at its root against our nature. Our species doesn't work like that. We're not ants or bees. And yeah, in America, centralization has gotten so bad, we've abandoned federalism such that we're literally in a crisis every 4 years, a minor political civil war, because it really, really matters who wins. If the wrong person gets in there, then you feel like you're just going to be subjugated to death. And federalism is a beautiful system. I just fear that it's also inherently unstable.
Yes. So this is a very important aspect of the book, is the instability of democracies.
Yeah.
I mean, I could go into this now or describe a bit the different chapters. What do you prefer?
Great question. Let's save. I want to talk about chapters. Folks, we're going to, after looking at this brilliant man's book, I had literally 100 questions. So I'm going to extend this interview behind the paywall at Substack at hamannature.com. So because we haven't dived into your chapters so much, I want to get into the climate change hysteria because I write about it quite a bit. Those models are the opposite of science. But along the way, can we make a brief pit stop at scientism? Because I think the one leads to the other.
So scientism is a social movement within science and derived from science that evolved in the 19th century, that is rooted in the wrong view that the positive sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, can explain everything around human life, that you can ultimately model human life using mathematics. The big guys who invented this are Frenchmen: Descartes, Laplace, and Auguste Comte. They basically invented scientism, whereas the Germans were against this, Immanuel Kant and Schelling, Hegel, Fichte, they were all against this. They didn't believe that you can mathematize the world and then explain everything. But French and then also English positivists believed this very much. And so scientism is this wrong attitude that you can basically measure everything and then determine society mathematically. Auguste Comte called sociology mathematical psychology. Right, so he believed that you can basically, by mathematically modeling the individual mind, you can then model society. And this is of course wrong. But what we have now, the worst form of scientism is Lysenkoism, when you actually develop scientific theories that are completely wrong, even from a scientific perspective, but then try to impose them on everyone else.
Horrifying.
Yes, and many areas of science that we have today are not. Many are full of scientism, but in a way it doesn't matter because they still create good results. Like in chemistry, you have many chemists who are brilliant chemists, but who are victims of scientism because they believe ultimately chemistry will explain the entire brain, for example, right? But they do good work in their daily scientific work. So these are the typical specialists who are doing no harm, but by being proponents of scientism. But then the Lysenkoists, who are now dominate basically the COVID or AIDS narratives, but also the climate narrative, they make up false theories and then basically prevent them from being debunked by kind of public tyranny, where everybody who contradicts them is ostracized, and also by, for example, withdrawing publication and funding possibilities from alternative research projects. And this is very dangerous and has now swept over the West in virology and preventive medicine, like immunization schemes, but also in the climate hysteria, in some other domains. And it's utterly dangerous and destructive and has nothing to do with real science. Real science is very modest and very hard to do.
Right.
So they have lost any sense of modesty and humbleness, these people.
That was very well said. From the outside looking in, as a non-scientist, the more people drift away from the skeptical, conservative, cautious, humble practice of science and move into this scientism, because it's inherently incorrect, it starts to look like a religion filled with dogma and high priests. And Anthony Fauci might as well have been speaking Latin up there in front of the TV. And how dare you question him? He is, after all, the science. And it's so weird to see something so useful to our species as the scientific method get perverted into just another stupid religion used to control the masses. It's so galling.
Yeah, so I would be careful. It's a pseudo religion because a real religion has two properties that this pseudo religion doesn't have. A real religion has transcendence, so something that where you have entities that are not of this world, and usually also has an answer for the question of the eternal life of the soul. All religions have this, and then it also has martyrs, real martyrs, so people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the religion. But these people who do Lysenkoist science, they don't sacrifice. They are full of privileges, right? So they don't suffer. They are basically part of the political class. And the politicization of science has always been predominant in the humanities, right? So if you read, like I did, 13th and 14th century political philosophy, it's completely dominated by the political interest that is behind the author. But science, natural science like physics, was for several centuries free of this. And it's now, and it became re-enslaved during World War II. To some extent in World War I, with chemistry being used to make chemical weapons and so on. But the re-enslavement happened, I think, in World War II. And it was a bit earlier. The eugenics movement is the first big scientist and also in a way Lysenkoist movement. I mean, Lysenko was later, but still eugenics is anti-scientific, but it was very popular in the 1920s in Britain. And then, of course, it was the Nazis and also the US. It was used for eugenic programs, really. And but the real breakthrough of this anti-science was the Manhattan Project, because the Manhattan Project gave politicians the false hope that if they spend enough money and effort and assemble the right quote unquote scientists, they can get any result out of science.
That's a good
And that
point.
has led to a new culture of science where huge pots of money are assembled and thrown at problems with the belief that then something must come out of it. And the whole, mRNA vaccine research effort is such an example. They spend billions and then something must come out of it, right? And it's an illusion. Science doesn't work like this. Science can stagnate for centuries and suddenly it picks up again. It's totally contingency. What goes on in science is very hard to predict or impossible. And I think these powerful people now believe that they can use science mechanically, like a simple causal chain. But it doesn't work like this, and it's self-harming to see science in the way they do.
You mentioned the Manhattan Project, and it reminded me that the CEO of Palantir, you're familiar with the company? Alex Karp, he was being interviewed by Barry Weiss earlier this year, I think. And he said that he was really upset with what Silicon Valley was doing and all these stupid scientists trying to satiate the demands of these idiot masses. Who cares about getting a sandwich to a guy in the fastest possible way with an app and a quadcopter? What science really needs to do is be put entirely under the government's thumb, much like the Manhattan Project. And that's how we'll really be engaged in a purposeful, human, nationalistic. It was horrifying. And this is the next to NVIDIA, this is the most profitable company in the world.
So the word I was missing when we talked about political centrism is subsidiarity.
Yeah.
So, and subsidiarity is also important in science. So when was the most productive age of science? It's very interesting. It was not in democracy, but it was during the feudal age and absolutism. And it happened, the peak was the 19th century and early 20th century when in Germany and also in England, but mostly in Germany, the princes, the federal princes, Germany was totally federal until 1919, very until 1871 totally, and then it was still quite federal until 1919, when the princes were competing for the best physicists and just financing them. Like people, they were financing people like Gauss or later other mathematicians and physicists. And then the small city of Göttingen obtained in just 10 or 15 years a number of Nobel Prizes like never before any other city. And that was because of subsidiarity, because the scientists, they could just work on the problems they thought were the problems where they have the highest likelihood to achieve something in their scientific lives. And they had the funding, they had excellent students with a great education to their disposition, and they just churned out great results. The age of Einstein, Max Planck, and so on, right? Where all the great discoveries in physics were made, mostly in Germany, and some also in other countries, but it has to do with giving scientists the freedom in the right cultural environment to do what they think is the best to bring science forward. So it's the exact opposite of what Karp is claiming it should be done. What Karp is claiming should be done is technocracy. Yep. So it's the idea to rule via science and technology, which will never work because human beings will rebel. They will not accept being ruled in such a mechanistic and superficial way.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, looking at the clock, I'm going to pivot and ask you questions about some of these hypes, including climate change and AI, in our bonus section behind the paywall. So as we start to close down this regular section of the interview, the political result of these hypes that you're talking about, you've mentioned it a few times, it's anti-democratic neo-feudalism. Mm-hmm. So maybe explain that term and the psychological result, which is that it seems like we're oscillating between irrational fears and irrational hopes and lowering the time preference we spoke about earlier. So talk about that a little bit.
So neo-feudalism is not a perfect term because in feudalism there was a between the ruler and the ruled, there was which was a hierarchical structure, right? With many levels of hierarchy, but at every level of hierarchy, there was a mutual feeling of responsibility also by the ruler for the ruled, and also necessity to take on responsibility and to take on duties. for example, the duty of leading the military efforts for self-defense or wars of aggression, which was totally the rule and task of the nobility. And so this feeling of mutual responsibility was real until the late Middle Ages. It then, with absolutism gaining momentum, the high top level high nobility lost this feeling of connectedness to the population, but it was very vivid in real feudalism. So therefore, neo-feudalism is not the perfect term, but neo-feudalism means that now the strategic property of the West is owned by just a couple of hundred families. So I believe that only 3,000 to 1,000 families over the entire West, so Western Europe plus the US and Canada, basically own, I don't know, 20-25% of the industrial production and media and so on assets. But they own them, or maybe they own less, maybe only 15 to 20%, but they own them in the way that they can, via the mechanisms of the post-market society we live in, control the rest of the property. So I call this strategic dominance in property and assets. And so, for example, if you own all the companies that make fertilizer and make grain, genetically modified grain, all the farmers are dependent of you. You can set the prices and dominate the farmers. And this is strategic property. And I think with this strategic ownership of all the assets, they have now become very, very influential. And I think these are the people who really rule us. But unlike in the age of feudalism, they are not visible. So in feudalism, the owners, the big owners, were the kings, the princes. They were also visible. They were also the official holders of power. But in our time, they are hidden from sight. And they basically rule via intermediaries, which are politicians, but also powerful managers like the manager of BlackRock or big banks or the Federal Reserve Bank, administrators, high-level administration employees. And these people basically now rule on behalf of the families that own the strategic assets. And this is a very legitimate form of ownership. It's post-democratic. It's in a way neo-feudal because so few rule over all the rest. And and they have zero sense of responsibility for the rest of the population. The COVID vaccination campaign is one example. Another very good example is the opioid crisis in the US. And so because the Britons in the 19th century, they exported opioids made in Afghanistan to China and forced the Chinese to accept these imports by war, actually, through the opium wars. But they didn't do this to their own population. But now we do it to our own population. And so this shows to what extent these people have become detached and cynical, and how they disregard their own populations. And this is very interesting and a new phenomenon. And then the last point I'd like to make is that unlike the feudal lords, today's oligarchs or plutocrats are culturally ignorant of the needs of the population. So they don't have a good feeling for cultural needs. And that's why they try to impose anti-cultural narratives very aggressively, like the DEI narrative, the racism narrative, and the transgender narrative, feminism. All these are narratives that show that they are culturally detached from the vast majority of the population. So this is, in a nutshell, how I define neo-feudalism.
Very nice. Okay, one last question for this side, and don't worry, it's an impossible one. You mentioned earlier that you think things are going to have to get a lot worse before the populace at large wakes up, so to speak. In the process of that waking up, what are one or two concepts you think they're going to have to really embrace in order to understand what happened and understand how to fix it?
So I think the populace waking up is not enough. So who needs to wake up is the administrative class. So the functional class that drives the big decision society, the top politicians, the top leaders of the big companies, the top administration employees, professors at the university, the big journalists who run the big newspapers. So this is the leadership class, and this class needs to wake up. Historically, whenever there was a change of the power structures, it was actually this class who made this change happen. These are the ones who need to wake up. What do they need? What are the big concepts they need to wake up? They need to feel threatened in their own positions. This is always the key, that this leadership class or functional class, administrative class, needs to see that its own position in society is threatened because the erosion is becoming too bad. And let me make two historical examples. One was 1648 in France, the Fronde, where actually the top nobility was revolting against the king because the mismanagement of the public finances by the king due to the Spanish-French War was so bad, they recognized if we continue like this, we're going to lose the war. France will become, we are going to lose all our territory. And they felt threatened by the bad policy of the king, so they made the Fronde. And while the Fronde didn't stop absolutism in France, it really changed the policy of the king. And in the end, France won the war against Spain. And the Fronde ended then with a victory against the Spaniards in 1654, I think. That's one example where the real top management class of society woke up and rebelled. And only if that happens, there's a change. If it's only the lower classes, they're just being crushed, like the peasant revolution in Germany in the 1520s. And our example to you as an American, you will like 1776. So in the wake of 1776, the upper class of the American settlers, who were, of course, subjects of the English crown, who were Englishmen in New England, these New England subjects of the crown realized that they were being abused by the taxation scheme of the crown. And so they rebelled. It was not the peasants who rebelled, but actually the top level of society, like people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. They were top level society members, very well educated, also wealthy and influential, and they drove the revolution. And I think this is the key learning that this is the layer of society which we belong intellectually and culturally. And these people must wake up, and they will wake up when they see that things are too bad. And then they will start questioning the concepts and also start reading books like my book, and being willing and ready to actually acknowledge this book. If I give this book now to an average member of my social stratum, they will just not read it. They will say, this is all conspiracy theory.
Well said. I very much like the reference to 1776 because as a political decentralist, I look at that, and that wasn't a civil war. We weren't trying to conquer London. That was a secessionist movement.
Exactly.
And I say we need a lot more of that. I think we need to decentralize politically so that we can re-engage in a more healthy manner commercially and culturally. Jobst Landgrebe, this was fabulous. I can't wait to dive into more of these hypes in the bonus section. Go to hamannature.com to subscribe to my Substack. Where we'll put a link to the book, obviously, wherever it can be found. But where would you direct people to connect with you on social media or websites or what have you?
Basically, I'm not very active on social media. Because I think that I'm what I do most of the day is reading scientific papers and making usage of them professionally and for my own writing, and this is because the information density is high. So I'm not so I need a lot of information density to be happy, and so therefore, the best to if you want to read what I wrote is to Google me, and then you will or to go to Google Scholar and Google me there. But basically, by Googling me, you will find everything I've written, and then you can read. So that's it.
See, folks, this is a wise man. So we'll put links to all that in the show notes. Thank you very much, Jobst. This was wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a big pleasure.
See you next time on Haman Nature, folks. Goodbye.